Philosophical Investigations by Ludwig Wittgenstein, a work on the philosophy of philosophy and of the philosophy of language, first published 1953. The principal ideas of which are: language is best conceived as an activity involving the uses of words as tools. Words are used in a multiplicity of ways and are to be understood by engaging in the language games in which they are employed. Words are not labels for things. For a large number of cases in which the word meaning is used, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. Discourse about sensations is understandable because there is a grammar of the word sensations and of such words as pain and remember, which can be grasped by anyone acquainted with the relevant language games. No reference to what one has in mind or feels privately makes sense unless it makes sense in this way: expecting, intending, remembering. These are the ways of life made possible for the use of language, and language itself is a way of life. Philosophical Investigations, published posthumously, contains in Part 1 a body of work completed by Wittgenstein by 1945. This material includes a preface in which he comments on the book, characterizing it as an album of sketches of landscapes. In virtue of its being a collection of philosophical remarks, by the use of which Wittgenstein attacked the problems with which he concerned himself. Parts 2 and 3, written between 1947 and 1949, were added by the editors G. E. M. Anscombe, who translated the work from the German, and R. Ries. The German and English versions appear side by side. Although the work has been in translation for a long time, of course, a discussion of its contents preceded its publication of the work because of the appearance of the Blue Book and the Brown Book, collections of typescripts and notes based on Wittgenstein's lectures at Cambridge. In part, the author's interest in the publication of the work during his lifetime came from a reluctance to test his reputation on second-hand reports of his philosophical remarks. An aura of mystery, then, surrounded the Philosophical Investigations when it finally appeared, and something of an aura yet remains as arguments having to do with the interpretation of the sense and direction of Wittgenstein's I'll start again. An aura of mystery then surrounded I'm doing this at, what time was it? 3 o'clock in the morning. Should have waited, I suppose. An aura of mystery then surrounded Philosophical Investigations when it finally appeared, and something of the aura yet remains as arguments having to do with the interpretation of the sense and direction of Wittgenstein's remarks tend to condition the understanding of the book. Nevertheless, there was little argument about the central theme, in spite of Wittgenstein's erratic and peripatetic method. The purpose of remarks managed to become clear. So, the point of the book appears to be that language is both conceived as an activity involving the uses of words as tools. There is a multiplicity of uses to which words can be put. To understand the meaning of an utterance is to understand the use to which it is put. Consequently, it is misleading and confusing to think of language as being made up of words which stand for objects. Understanding the uses of words is like understanding the rules of games, and just as confusion results when a player in a game makes up new rules as he or she goes along, or misapplies the rules, or conceives of the game in some static fashion, so it causes confusion and perplexity when a user of language creates new rules, violates old ones, or misconceives language. To be clear about language, one must look to its uses. But if all that Wittgenstein meant to do with his remarks were to say this, he could have done the job with a great deal less effort and at considerable less length. The Investigations is not so much a report of the results of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations as it is itself an investigation in progress, and what it deals with and exhibits are philosophical investigations. In other words, Wittgenstein's remarks are used to show that certain philosophical problems arise because language is misconceived, and because of the author's adroit use of language, we are led to conceive of language as instrumental. In a sense, then, the book is what it is about. Its process, as a proof, is its evidence. What is it to investigate philosophically? Wittgenstein's answer is it is not to seek theses or theories, and it is not to find static meanings or objects for which words are permanent labels. It is rather to understand by understanding the uses of language relevant to the problem at hand, in order to discover how philosophical problems arise when, as he puts it, language goes on a holiday. That is, when a user of language takes off in a new, unpredictable direction as a result of failing to abide by the rules of a particular language game. One might support Wittgenstein at this point by saying that what poets do intentionally in order to be poets, philosophers do in ignorance, and hence are philosophers. In the preface to the book, Wittgenstein declares that he had hoped to bring the remarks of the book into some coherent whole, but such an attempt, he came to realize, could never succeed. He suggests that philosophical investigations involves coming at a problem from a number of different directions. On the point concerning coherence, one might, with justification, dissent here, though it is true that escape from a static conception of language is made possible by a series of relevant demonstrations of the uses of language, there is no reason why the points of the book could not have been clearly made seriatim, even if to do so eccentric uses of language would have been necessary. A number of problems could then have been dealt with in the Wittgenstein fashion, a fashion which could have illuminated the eccentric uses of language. In fact, this is what almost happens in the investigations. Now and then we catch the author presenting a thesis, and it is clear that the problems he considers, suggested by his own odd uses of language in the expression of his theses, are intended to illustrate and support his points. Yet Wittgenstein had a streak of philosophical coyness, sometimes disguising itself as a kind of insight, which led him, presumably for theoretical reasons, but more likely for effect, sometimes to withhold the moral of the tale, the destination of his philosophical wanderings. There are two principal metaphors by the use of which Wittgenstein has sought to make his meaning clear. The metaphor of language as a game, and the metaphor of language as a tool. Or to be more accurate, the metaphors of language as games or as tools. After describing a primitive language which could be described as involving a practice of calling for objects by the use of words, Wittgenstein writes, and I quote, "We can think of the whole process of using words as one of those games by means of which children learn their native language. I will call these games language games, and will sometimes speak of a primitive language as a language game. I shall also call the whole consisting of language and the actions into which it is woven the language game." That is from number 7. In part 1, which comprises the largest section of the work, the remarks are numbered. For convenience in referring to this work, since there are no chapters, section headings, or other devices for locating oneself, these numbers I will mention in what follows. Then, in number 11, Wittgenstein writes, "Think of the tools in a toolbox. There is a hammer, pliers, a saw, a screwdriver, a rule, a glue pot, glue, nails, and screws. The functions of words are as diverse as the function of these objects." End quote. But what is the point of using the expression language game? Wittgenstein answers, and I quote, "Here the term language game is meant to bring into prominence the fact that the speaking of language is part of the activity or of a form of life." End quote. That's in number 23. He then presents a list of some of the functions of language, for example, giving orders, describing, reporting events, making up stories, translating. And he comments, and I quote, "It is interesting to compare the multiplicity of the tools in language and of the ways they are used the multiplicity of kinds of word and sentence with what logicians have said about the structure of language, including the author of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. End quote. That's in number 23. Speaking of himself in the third person there, the references to his own earlier work of 1921, in which he defended a logical atomism, a philosophy which would elucidate problems by devising an ideal language in which for each simple subject or property there would be a fixed, unambiguous symbol, ironically the very conception of language which the Investigations examines and rejects. The simile that using an utterance is like making a move in a game suggests the problem, what is a game? If language involves simply the use of names as labels, then there is a definite answer to the question. But if the word game is used in various ways, it may very well be there is no object, no essential nature, to which the word game calls attention. Indeed, this conclusion is what Wittgenstein argues. In response to the supposition that there must be something common to the proceedings called games, he urges everyone to look and see whether there is anything common at all, or common to all. To look and see whether there is anything common to all. And he ends the survey of games by remarking, and I quote, "And the result of this examination is, we see, a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overall similarities, sometimes similarities of detail." End quote. That's in number 66. He introduces the expression family resemblances to characterize the similarities. The point is that just as games form a family, so do the various uses of an expression. To look for common meanings, then, is as fruitless as to look for the essential nature of games. The only way of making sense out of a problem having to do with the essence of language or the meaning of a word is by examining language as it is actually used in a multiplicity of ways. The theme of the investigations is introduced shortly before the philosophical investigations into the essence of games. And I quote, "For large classes of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus: the meaning of a word is its use in the language." End quote. That's from number 43. I shall end it here for now and continue in part 2 of this look at philosophical investigations at the understanding of this critical sentence, because understanding that sentence that I've just said is to understand the investigations.